Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. I'm Kurt DiCamillo, the curator of fine art and American ancestors. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at any point during the presentation. We will answer as many as we can at the end. I also want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and thank you for your patience. Even if you do lose connection, you will have access to a full recording on our website that you can watch at any time. In 1924, Iris and Antonio Origo, an Anglo-American heiress and an Italian marquis, purchased La Foce, a vast Italian estate with a half-ruined 15th century villa at its core. Located in a wild and desolate valley in southern Tuscany, the restoration of the estate became Iris and Antonio's lifetime project. Fired by a profound impulse to make a difference to others, the couple set about making social and agricultural changes in this forgotten corner of Italy, where they dedicated their lives to transforming an impoverished terrain into a thriving landscape of wheat fields, olive groves, and vineyards. They refurbished the house and designed one of the most beautiful landscapes in Italy, a garden of elegant terraces, roses, fountains, and a wisteria-covered pergola. Today, a United Nations World Heritage Site, the landscape is an internationally famous example of the harmony that can exist between man and nature. Today, Katia Lisi, granddaughter of Iris and Antonio, will tell us an enthralling story of love, war, and rebirth, all documented by new and old photographs from the family archives. I would like to thank the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Foundation for their steadfast support of the Art and Architecture webinar series. Katia Lisi was born in Rome and has worked in publishing, journalism, Italian television, and as a literary translator from English and French into Italian. In 2016, she edited an unpublished war diary, A Chill in the Air, by her grandmother, Iris Origo. In 2024, La Foce, Paradise in Tuscany, Katia's book on her ancestral home, was published to great acclaim. Please join me in welcoming Katia Lisi.
Hello, good evening to everyone. Thank you for listening to my talk. I'd like to start after Kurt's beautiful introduction. He's pretty much got it all in a nutshell, but I want to go into details now. This is a bird's eye view of La Foce, part of the garden and the villa and the surrounding countryside as it looks today. This is therefore feast your eyes on this greenery because the photo that comes next will show you what it looked like in 1924 when my grandparents, Iris and Antonio Origo, arrived in this desolate, windswept, barren corner of southern Tuscany, the Val d'Orcia. The Val d'Orcia, as you can see from this photograph, was little but an expanse of grey clay hills. My grandmother, who the author Iris Origo describes these clay hills as being as grey and wrinkled as an elephant's back. That is more or less what they look like. There's still some small parts of the scenery which show them. But when they arrived in 1924, this was what it looked like, and they both came from extremely privileged backgrounds. My grandfather, as we'll see in the next photograph, Antonio Rigo, was an Italian nobleman. We'll say more about him later. And in 1924, he married Iris Origo, next photograph, who was an Anglo-American heiress. Her mother was an Anglo-Irish member of the nobility, and her father was American. And in point of fact, the whole reason for Iris's coming to Italy and meeting Antonio was due to her parents. Her American family was a very wealthy New York family, the Cuttings. So she was born Iris Cutting. And they lived in a beautiful estate then called Westbrook on Long Island. But the estate has since become a state park, a New York state park. It was donated by the family after the last direct descendant, apart from Iris, died. Iris was, unfortunately, the Cutting family was the family illness, shall we say, hit many of the members. And Iris's father was Bayard Cutting, and he died at the age of only 30, leaving behind a widow and a 7-year-old daughter. In his farewell letter to his widow, Sybil, he specifically states that he wants his daughter, his small daughter Iris, to grow up somewhere where she does not belong, outside of America, somewhere where she cannot put down roots, so she can be really free of this national feeling that has caused so much harm. He was thinking of the Civil War, but it then proved sadly true for other wars. Anyway, Sybil Cutting at that point decided that the ideal place to grow a young, very wealthy girl would be Florence. And as we see in the next photograph, she moved to Villa Medici on the slopes surrounding Florence. Villa Medici was a Renaissance villa, a beautiful Renaissance villa built for Lorenzo the Magnificent, where he escaped the summer heat of Florence with his court of humanists and poets and architects, the great names of Renaissance Florence. So Villa Medici was where the young Iris and Sybil moved. The gardens of Villa Medici, and indeed the house itself, were restored for Sybil by a British architect called Cecil Pinsent. It's the same architect of La Foce, so we can look carefully at these gardens and see how much the elements of these gardens are repeated in La Foce. The wisteria-covered pergola, it's not so evident in this photograph, but it's on the left. The big lemon pots with lemon, the terracing, the geometric box hedges, they're all elements that recur in La Foce. So Cecil Pinsent was actually working, just before he started on Villa Medici, he was working on Bernard Berenson's villa close by, in fact, just next door, called I Tatti. He and his business partner, who was somebody called Geoffrey Scott, who then went on to write a very famous book on architecture, and it's called The Architecture of Humanism. That's important because the early Renaissance, the humanist period, was very much a source of inspiration to both himself and to Cecil Pinsent, who then went on to become one of the creators of some of the most beautiful gardens in the expat community in Florence. In Iris Origo married Antonio in 1924. This is wonderful photograph. It's them leaving Villa Medici for this desolate landscape. Coming up now. This is what they were going to. So Iris and Antonio were both going from their very privileged backgrounds, especially Iris, to this. Why is the question, of course. the fact is that they had a vision. They really wanted to make a difference to people's lives. And they purposefully chose a vast estate in this totally desolate valley where people lived in extreme poverty, and there was 85% of illiterate people. There were no kind of health or services, of course, and no schools, no roads even. So the 54 farms on this vast estate were also very isolated. There was the families lived among themselves. They set about changing the landscape, first of all, changing it through agriculture. Agriculture meant prosperity. So you see here they're digging out the stones out of this very barren soil because it's mostly clay. As you know, clay is very difficult if there's no water because the Valdorcia's big problem is scarcity of water. Still today, I mean, a lot has changed, but water is still a problem. When water runs off clay, of course, it doesn't sink into the soil. So a lot of the first early work was water management. So building reservoirs and dams and wells where there was some, and just channeling the water so that it would be directed towards the fields. So the basis of everything was what was called, at the time, it was also a big government-funded project in many parts of Italy. In the Valdorcia, it was the Origos funding it, but mostly. But it was called bonifica, so that means the reclamation of the land, making the land good again. And bonifica meant it was an agricultural thing, but it also meant bonifica umana, so a social reclamation. That meant that prosperity would bring the money for investing in social changes. And of course, the primary concerns were building roads, building schools, and giving the people some form of health care. We have some more photographs of reforestation was also a major problem because the wars in the 15th and 16th centuries in Italy had most of the forests that then covered this land were cut down for war purposes. And of course, that brought about desertification, and therefore replanting trees was a big part of my grandparents' social project. And sorry, agricultural project. This is the Valdorcia today. This is the view just below La Foce. It's amazing to me every time I look at it to think that this all changed in such a short period. I mean, actually shaping the landscape, we think of it as a major thing to do. In point of fact, from 1924 to the start of a war, so 1939, when all activity stopped because, of course, people were called up and there were other very big concerns. In just those very few years, the landscape took on such a different aspect. The next photograph shows a very well-known site. This has almost become an icon of Tuscany. It's sort of a symbol of the Renaissance landscape in Tuscany. In point of fact, those green hills that you see, that they're green because it's the young wheat is coming up, so it's a springtime photograph. And those are the same clay hills that you saw in the first photograph. So an incredible change. The fact is that new farmhouses were built. Small plots of land were assigned to the farmers. And of course, they had to build a road to reach the new farmhouses. And being my grandparents, they thought it was very important that the road should be functional, but also that it should be beautiful. And therefore, they looked for inspiration in the frescoes of the 14th and 15th century in Florence and Siena. I'm thinking about Ambrogio Lorenzetti, for example, Buon Governo in Siena. The next photograph is still the Valdorcia today, but these clay outcrops are still present, of course, much reduced, and they're now protected because they're an environmental landmark. So let's say that this is a bucolic period for my grandparents from 1924 to the beginning to actually the beginning of war, but tragedy strikes in 1933. Next photograph shows my grandmother with her son Gianni. So the Origos had a son in 1925. He was called Gianni, by all accounts, a beautiful, charming, intelligent little boy. Unfortunately, he died of the family illness. The family illness, I think I didn't mention before, the Cuttings were struck down by tuberculosis. Iris lost her father when she was the same age as Gianni when he died, so 7.5. Of course, it was a terrible blow for my grandfather. Of course, it was also the loss of the only heir, male heir to the Origo name. And they went through a very difficult period, but they continued in their work on the land. And many, in fact, a lot of the work at that point was focused on children in Gianni's memory. Next photograph shows a school and a nursery school. So primary school and nursery school were both built. It's actually my grandmother in the photograph with her dogs and this wonderful border of irises in bloom. The school was absolutely fundamental. It's interesting to see the landscape in the background is still very wild. There's still a lot of wild clay hills, not cultivated yet. This is 1934, 35, so immediately after Gianni dies. And children from all over the La Foce estate come to school. My grandmother hit on the perfect way of convincing the parents to send them to school, because it was far away and it was difficult, and the children didn't have shoes. So she would send out a horse-drawn carriage, or to the ones who lived really far away on remote farms and didn't really have proper roads, an ox-drawn carriage. And I don't know if any of you know how slowly oxen move. It's absolutely excruciating. So those children must have been sitting for hours before arriving in school. Anyway, they were given a free lunch. And you can see here, I mean, we're talking about the early 30s in a remote part of fascist Italy. Iris Origo did pretty much what she wanted. She certainly did not adhere to the fascist curriculum, which is mostly learning by rote and marches and dressing up in uniforms. On the contrary, she was very much inspired by Montessori. You can see the child-sized furniture. The teachers were instructed to read to the children a lot, to never raise their voice, and to always make sure that there were fresh flowers in the classroom. So that was very much my grandmother's line of teaching. She also set up for the children a whole vaccination program, which was obviously very, very important. The school was also important because it brought people from remote farms together. They would come and pick up the children at the end of the day. So instead of the children being brought to the fields with them from the age of 2 or 3, they were just brought into the fields, and the mothers would either work with them on the back or on their back, or they would be required to chip in. So obviously a huge difference, and we're not talking about that long ago, really. It's a couple of generations, not more than that. The children, after the war broke out, the schools had to shut down, and my grandmother thought, oh, well, now that the school is closed, I can use it to house the refugee children from the beginning of the war. So the first children to be hosted in the school were children from Genoa, Turin, the first cities to be bombed by the Allies. More or less what was happening in Britain, where children were evacuated to the countryside. It wasn't so common in Italy, but my grandmother, being Anglo-American, was very much inspired to do the same. Here she is, sitting in the photograph. This is a photograph from 1943, which I can tell because she's holding my aunt, Donata, and my mother, Benedetta, is the little girl in the hat in the front row. The others are refugee children who were taken in and who were absolutely blissfully happy. So we still have letters from the parents of these children, because they were not orphans, most of them. They were children who were living in the gutters or in cellars and really needed fresh country air, good food, because food was more available in the countryside, of course. And I have all these letters thanking my grandmother and asking her if she would please take in a little brother or a big sister. So there were a lot of children. By the end of it, there was about 25 children. This next photograph is a photograph of the plywood sign that the Origos put up in Montepulciano. So what happened was that the Germans came in, and in 1944, when they were fleeing from the Allies who were coming up from the south, and they were then kicked out with all these children to look after. And they were right in the middle of the front line. So the Allied planes were bombing the fields. There were mines everywhere. There were obviously bodies. And the Origos just gathered up all those children with a few of the people on the estate. And they crossed kilometers and kilometers, because Montepulciano is 10 kilometers away. And some of the children were very small. So in these very dangerous circumstances, they brought them to safety in Montepulciano, and which was still occupied by the Germans, but they had friends who were hosting them. So outside the friends' home, they put this sign outside their palazzo in the hopes that the Germans would leave them alone. In point of fact, the Allies arrived very few days later. In the next photograph, we'll see the partisans. There were a lot of groups of partisans in the woods around La Foce. And La Foce became, during the war, not just a place where children found refuge and people looked to Iris and Antonio for help of all kinds. It also became a center of, certainly of the resistance, but the interesting thing is that the Origos helped everyone, not just, obviously, the partisans, obviously people from their own estate or from the surrounding countryside who were in need, but also young fascist soldiers who were who were deserters. They just wanted to get back home to their families, and of course, if they were caught, they would be shot. So everybody was helped, and La Foce became a kind of a well-known place for people to go and ask for help. Of course, this was very dangerous for them, especially for my grandmother, because she wasn't Italian, though she was protected by the fact of being married to an Italian landowner. I have a picture of her American passport with cancelled on it. It means that she had to give up her American nationality in order to stay on in Italy and not be viewed as an enemy, an enemy alien, which is what happened to her mother, who sadly had to leave Florence, go to Switzerland, and died during the war without ever seeing her daughter Iris again. Anyway, we're going back in time again to 1924 when the Origos arrive and they buy this rather crumbling 15th century villa. And immediately Iris calls in Cecil Pinsent to restore it. This is what it looks like today. So the villa was extensively restored and beautifully modified by Cecil Pinsent, but the Iris was very much she very much wanted a garden. So next photograph will show just the very beginnings of the garden at La Foce. We can tell from the photograph that Gianni's in the photograph, so it must be before 1933 when he died. But the thing is that the garden didn't get started immediately because the priority in Valdorcia, as I've said, was water. And of course, with all their wonderful social plans, the Origos couldn't come in and waste water on the garden. It was needed for agriculture. So until the American grandmother of Iris came in and saw what the situation was, until she gave funds for a special pipeline to be built up in the woods above La Foce, where it would not be needed for agricultural purposes, she gave the money for a pipeline to be built. And at that point, Iris could start her garden. You can see it's a very small effort at the beginning. Iris says, I just need somewhere to sit and read and be out of the dust and the flies and the heat of the Valdorcia. Cecil Pinsent was very well known for his Renaissance-style gardens. That means, above all, he valued geometry, the harmony between man and nature, perfect proportions, whereas Iris also wanted him to add color and flowers. So this beautiful combination, in my grandmother's time, these box hedges, which I'll show you in the next photograph, were very small and full of flowers. Nowadays, they're not, because we wouldn't be able to see them if not from the house, which is actually where this photograph was taken. So this is the same garden. In the center, there's a fountain with a Venetian dolphin of the 16th century, and the contours of the basin are by Cecil Pinsent. This is typical of him. He also, those columns with the urns that you can see in the background, all these Renaissance architectural details are very much a part of his vision, and he was extremely good at blending various elements together, ancient and modern. Again, yes, this is again an aerial view of the fountain garden, as we call it. So this was the very first part of the garden. When water was available, the next part of the garden shows how it's being expanded. Oh, throughout the garden, the only material used is stone travertine, a travertine marble, actually, which was very, very white when it was first put in, but immediately became a very pleasing shade of gray with moss. And I mean, you can tell the difference between the old photographs and the ones of now. Next photograph also shows this very white wall, which then becomes quite soon, next photograph, yes, covered with wisteria. lemon garden. This is the lemon garden. So this is a series of stanze, of green rooms, which are divided by these very geometrical box hedges. But the geometry, which could be rather rigid, is very pleasingly covered with flowers, lemon pots, small wild flowers that grow in the cracks of a travertine, and of course, the beautiful light of a Tuscan evening. Next photograph shows the lemon garden and the wisteria pergola that runs along it, because the last part of not the last part, but the upper garden, as it was known, the rose garden, is more inspired by a more English. We call it the English garden, and the box hedges is the Italian garden. It's not strictly true, but that's how my grandmother, in this period, she's shown in this photograph in her favorite spot in the garden, under a small pergola with surrounded by plants, her favorite chaise longue. She would bring out her books and write on this chaise longue rather uncomfortably, I think, but surrounded by flowers and by beauty. This wall is full of campanula and wallflowers. The lemons in the lemon garden, this is the next photograph, shows the limonaia, which is the orangery where the lemon pots are stored during the winter. La Foce is at an altitude of 600 meters, so that means it's hilly country, and it can get very cold in the winter, it can go below zero, and the lemons need to be sheltered in the limonaia. The next photograph shows us the same limonaia when it was just being built. This is 1940, and this is a big party in celebration of finally another Origo child. So 7 years after Gianni's death, my mother Benedetta was born, and a big party was held on the lawn outside the limonaia with all the people of the estate dancing. Let's go back to the garden. This is the upper garden, the rose garden, in point of fact, the English garden. So a lot of lavender, roses, peonies, ornamental garlic. Let's say it's a garden of flowers and color. Here it is in the light of the sunset. The flower beds are geometrically designed. Again, Pinsent had a hand in this. And it's bordered by this wonderful wisteria pergola, which we can see in the next photograph too. The wisteria pergola was actually my grandparents' favorite place to walk at the end of a day and sort of take stock of what had been done, what still needed to be done. So and so needs a new pig. This other guy needs to be given money for a tractor. And it was also, during wartime, the place where they took some most difficult decisions, because if an Allied prisoner of war, escaped prisoner of war, came asking for help, they would give it, but they had to evaluate the risks to their own people, because they would send them off to some remote farm, knowing whether they were never refused, but they knew very well that if they were discovered, they would be the contadino who was giving them hospitality would be shot along with his family. So this is a place where difficult decisions were made. Again, the pergola with steps leading up to a 17th century Venetian statue. You can see these typical, this is typical Pinsent, these urns Below, we've seen them with lids. Here they're without lids, and they're planted with geraniums. And finally, the last part of the garden, is very striking. It's like a sort of a ship jutting out towards the scenery of the Val d'Orcia, which today is stunning and at the time was still being shaped. Yes, here it is today. So that's exactly the same photograph. Those hedges, those cypresses have been trimmed. It's a little bit like a green theatre, and there's a double hedge of cypress and ilex trees. These incredibly strict geometrical shapes fit into each other perfectly of the box hedges. And at the end, a pond with a bench and again a 17th century Venetian statue. So again, old and new are blended. The lower garden is reached by a double, again, travertino staircase. You see how very new it looks and how very white. It took about 10 years for it to stop looking so very white. There's a double staircase, and again, this late Renaissance this time, sort of inspiration with bugnato and urns and a belvedere from which to admire the view. This is what it looks like today. You see the travertino has aged, the wisteria has grown, and the whole garden is really an amazing sight. This is one of the most photographed parts of the garden. You can see them here. It's viewed from the other side. It was a challenge for any designer. I think Cecil Pinsent was very well suited to meet this challenge from an architectural point of view, because you can see that the garden slopes upwards, and indeed the whole of La Foce garden is built on a rather steep hillside. So all of Pinsent's training in terracing in the gardens of Florence stood him in good stead. Again, this is I want to talk a little bit about La Foce today. This is my mother waving at you from the fountain garden. La Foce is privately owned by the Origo family still, and we have made it also a center of culture. So in honor of my grandmother's literary legacy, of course, but also in honor of my very musical part of my family. My brother, Antonio, here he is, sitting on another part of a garden which overlooks Montamiata. That's the big mountain which dominates the Val d'Orcia. 39 years ago, he set up a chamber music festival, which brings music to La Foce and to many other beautiful parts of the Val d'Orcia. So we very much want this legacy to go on. The book I wrote, which is called La Foce Paradise in Tuscany, is dedicated to my brother who passed away 2 years ago. But the concerts continue, and the garden is open to visitors on certain days. And La Foce itself, the whole estate, has become an organic farm in the sense that we don't use pesticides, and we try to plant old species of wheat. It's sad to say that the landscape is very beautiful, but it's not great farming country. On the other hand, just this very poverty of the land is what saved the Val d'Orcia from the development that hit so many other parts of Tuscany, especially after the war and in the 1960s and 1970s. La Foce was protected by all that and by the vision that my grandparents had so many years ago. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Katya. That was really enchanting. Before we get to your questions, we have some upcoming programs that I would like to mention. On March 13th, I will be hosting Christopher Ridgway, curator at Castle Howard, for his lecture, Slain, Slain, Beheaded, and Imprisoned, How the Howard Family Survived the Tudors. On March 27th, I will host historian Adrian Tinniswood. He'll be talking about his new book on the amazing houses of the Guinness family. And finally, on April 17th, I will be presenting Classical Architecture and Decorative Arts in British Houses, the first of a two-part lecture series. You can find out more about these programs at americanancestors.org/events. We have just a few spots left on our May tour of America's most historic city. Of course, that would be Boston, and we would love to have you join us. You can find more information about this tour and other tours by going to americanancestors.org/heritage tours. Now let's get to your questions. Go ahead and type your query into the question panel at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer as many questions as we can in the time that we have left. And I'm going to start off more. There's so many questions that I popped into my mind, Katya. You were telling us during the rehearsal a few days ago that just this week was discovered on your estate an Etruscan necropolis from the 6th century BC. Would you like to add anything to that? Because that's just an amazing statement.
It's yes, it is amazing. It's a really incredible feeling to come across something that has just been sitting just 6 feet under the surface. A series of tombs from the 6th and 7th century before Christ. This was the whole of the land around La Foce, but the whole of the region was Etruscan. There were some of the major Etruscan towns. And in that period, the period of those tombs was during the reign of Lars Porsena, who was probably the only really great Etruscan king. He a necropolis, it wasn't entirely a surprise. So what happened was we were with a lot of permits from the fine arts department. We were digging a pool in the garden of one of the farmhouses. And of course, we had an archaeologist present, and these tombs came to light almost immediately, 20 minutes after the first the beginning of the digs. It was 20 minutes on. It was clear that there was a whole lot of things going on there. Urns and little vases where their oil would be. Today, what came to light was the spindle, a bronze spindle intact, which apparently is quite rare, of a woman. We could tell by all the ornaments in the tomb. There was a woman buried there, probably of noble descent, because she was accompanied by beautiful glasses and plates for her to drink and eat in the afterlife. And alas for her, she had to spin as well in the afterlife, because we've also found her spindle and for her spinning wheel. And also a beautiful bronze buckle for her belt. So that was very exciting. It's just suddenly these things resurface from the past, and that's one of the joys of living in Etruscan country.
Um, it's astonishing to learn of the depth of poverty in this part of Tuscany. Can you tell us why there was such poverty here?
That's a very interesting question, because it wasn't always so. In the Middle Ages, the Val d'Orcia was known as the granary of Siena. Apparently, it was beautiful with forests and woods, and we have a lot of documents from the Middle Ages and early Renaissance that tell us it was a beautiful farmland. What happened was, first of all, the plague. The plague hit the Tuscan countryside very hard. And a lot of people died and couldn't look after the land. And to make matters worse, constant wars were being waged between Florence and Siena. And the Valdorcia was kind of in between and in the orbit of one or the other, according to who won. And little towns, very small towns like Pienza, would be sacked something like 5 times a year. So
Wow.
obviously, this was incredibly. I mean, there's not much population left. What with the plague and the wars, and then deforestation because all the woods were cut down because the only real war material they had was wood, and um, and then desertification happened. There was no more greenery to attract rain, and it gradually became a clay desert, which of
Yeah,
course made
you
yeah.
can see that in your early photographs. There's a
Mm.
lot of interest about your grandmother's family. Can you tell us about
Yes,
that some
yes,
more?
the cuttings, that's wonderful to know. So Westbrook is what it was called in my grandparents' time. Now it's the William Byatt Cutting Arboretum. It's a state park, New York State Park, on Long Island. And it's called William Byatt Cutting in memory of my grandmother's grandfather. Sorry, he was William Byatt Cutting, and it was donated by the family uh, when the last member of the family died. My grandmother at that point was already in Italy and married to my grandfather. And it's a beautiful place. It's a wonderful arboretum and beautifully run. It's a state park, so it's open to visitors. It was very close to my grandmother's heart, and she writes about it extensively in her memoirs. She wrote a book called Images and Shadows, which is her childhood memoirs. She lived in so many different incredibly rich worlds from Ireland of her Anglo-Irish grandparents to America to Florence, where I forgot to say that her mother.
Sounds like we may have lost Katya there for a second. Um, we may actually have to cut it back there if we don't get Katya back. Not too terrible to end this way. We had a few more questions I wanted to ask her, but I will say that if anyone else has any questions that we haven't gotten to, you can email us at any time at heritagetours@americanancestors.org. Thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and to others enjoy. Actually, I just have an email from Geneva saying that we think Kati is back. Kati, are you back?
Yes, what happened?
Well,
Okay,
this is the
something with
modern world that
me.
we live
This
in.
is the Etruscans.
Is it the Etruscans? This is their revenge. Actually, if I could sort of dovetail on what you were talking about with your grandmother,
Yes,
we have a
yes.
number of people who want to know about A Chill in the Air, her book. And apparently she
Yeah,
wrote a book
that's
about the
beautiful.
war as well, or maybe this is the same book.
So her no, her most famous book is War in Valdorcia, which is a
Yes, that's
war
the one we have.
diary, and that's the one that tells of the escape from La Foce across the fields with the refugee children, and it just details. It starts with the arrival of these refugee children, and then it's just everyday life in a country that's suddenly struck by war, that a war that it doesn't understand and doesn't want. Um, and then after my grandmother died, quite a while afterwards, I was looking through her papers and I realized that she had a whole stack of papers, which were a diary going back to the period before the war. So the period of 1939, 1940, because Italy entered the war in June 1940. So A Chill in the Air is the result. I put together the papers and edited them. And A Chill in the War is another diary, but it's a pre-war diary. It's the prequel to War in Valdorcia, and it's called A Chill in the Air because it perfectly reflects that sense of foreboding, of chill, that is of a war coming on
Mm,
that
mm.
the Italians are not always convinced of. So despite there's very much a lot of Mussolini's propaganda in it, which was carried out through the radio. And of course, the parallel with our internet and fake news, because Mussolini's propaganda was essentially a type of fake news.
Of
So
course.
that's very interesting parallel.
I think all propaganda is. Um, are
Yeah.
both those books still in print?
Yes, indeed. They've been printed by the New York Review of Books, the New York Review Classics series. Um, and that's in America, and in Britain by Pushkin Press.
I should tell you, we've had people telling us that they have loved your lecture and have already ordered the book after hearing
Oh, how
you.
wonderful. How
Uh,
lovely.
so you moved to La Foce yourself. How long ago did
Yes.
that happen?
I would say 15 years ago. My mother said, "Look, I need help."
I
Quite
understand
rightly.
that. And getting back to your grandmother again, how old were you when she died?
Oh, she lived to see my first child, so I was very, very close to my grandmother. My father was a concert violinist, and in the early years of his marriage, since I'm their eldest daughter, he traveled a lot with my mother and would leave. I would be left with my grandmother. So she was the one who, read my first books to me, and I mean, she took a great interest in my literary education, and she was a very, very good teacher. This is something that my mother always points out. She said it was amazing how her ability to transmit knowledge to children, and her interest in young children's minds.
That's astonishing because I don't think
Yeah.
many adults have that. And I got
No.
the feeling for that with the fact that she was involved with Montessori schools,
Yeah.
but also that photograph you had of the children in the
Yes.
school. You could feel that sense of
Yes.
true kindness
Yes.
and compassion and
Yeah.
sharing.
Yes, yes. And also, just those things that were so very different from an Italian education, state education, so this thing
Mm,
of never
mm.
shouting at children, reading to them, not having them just memorize, learn by rote. Um, it was just very much a part of her way of learning. She never, I remember she would, well, read out a lot of poetry to me. Her way of teaching was to um, read books, really.
Mm. How
So that's a
wonderful.
wonderful way of reaching a young child.
I'm going to take you back to the garden again because Mitchell
Yes.
asks, what is the size of your garden staff today?
Oh, well, that very much depends. Our gardeners are very, very able, so we have about 4 or 5, depending on the season.
I can only assume this is true anywhere in the world as it is in Britain, which is what I'm most familiar with. And
Yes.
what I'm saying is from the turn of the last century to meaning the early 20th century, you would have 50 gardeners, and the garden would be the same size today, and you'd only need 10
Okay.
because of mechanization, because of new equipment, things that
Yes.
enable you to
But
do the things. So
yes.
I think for those of us of a certain age, I'm 65, you just assume that gardens like yours take a lot of people to do, and that certainly was true 100 years ago. But I think
Yes.
now it's hard for us to get the fact that you can get the same results. I remember being on an estate in Scotland and seeing this is probably 10 years ago now, these robots
Mm,
mowing the lawns,
mm.
which is very sort of creepy actually. But those kinds of things I think make it easier and easier to keep a garden like yours looking as wonderful as it does.
You're partly true, but for us, it's partly true. But our kind of garden doesn't allow, of course, we have things to trim the box hedges, but we don't have too much because it's there's a lot of steps in our garden.
Yes,
It's
yes.
it's very terraced, and the paving stones are rather uneven, so there's less mechanization than you would think. But I think part of it, you're right. There used to be 50 people living at La Force. Of course, this was the indoor staff as well, not just the gardeners. But there was also the feeling that you had to look after as many people as possible. It was, you had to give jobs. So I
Yes.
think, there was a lot of that going on too.
You gave me a very interesting segue into something I wanted to ask, which is that La Foche's garden reminds me very much of a garden in Wiltshire, England called Iford Manor. And that was
Mm,
designed by an English architect who was the contemporary of Cecil Pinsent, and his name was Harold Peto. And I'm wondering if you
yes.
have any knowledge of Harold Peto and if possibly he and Cecil Pinsent knew each other.
Who knows? That's a very interesting question and something that I will explore. But of course, yes, I know Peter by fame, but no, I
Well,
don't know of any direct contact between them.
I will send you some pictures of Iford Manor because it's the same
Yes.
thing. When this was only created, even though it's an 18th century house, only created in early 20th century, the garden, because it's
Mhm,
so
mhm.
steep that everyone said you can
Yes,
never put a garden here. That will never work. It's too
yes,
steep. And Harold
yes.
Peto came in and he believed, as I suspect that Pensant must have, that objects like statues were just as important as the
Mm,
plants. All of this
mm,
was part of a harmonious whole.
mm.
And that's something I very much got to feel of in your presentation today. And
Yes.
that is actually the last question. So I will now officially say, welcome back. We lovely to have you come back after that little brief pause and say to everybody who joined us, stay safe, stay healthy, and great thanks to Katya. We hope to see you soon again on our future online programs. Goodbye for now.
Thank you. Thank you very much to
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.